Now, with the special Oireachtas committee to look at assisted dying here, it's being headed by Michael Healy-Rae, could we soon be following countries like Australia and Canada in making it a reality for patients who are near the end of their lives? Well, to talk about this issue, I'm joined now by the director of the Iona Institute and columnist with the Sunday Independent, David Quinn, and Tom Curran, director with Exit International and partner of the late assisted dying campaigner Marie Fleming. Good morning and welcome to you both. It's not permitted at the moment, so Tom, will you make the case as to why it should?
Well, it's simply a matter of choice. If people feel that they don't want to continue on with a difficult life, mainly because of an illness, then I think they should have that choice to decide that they don't want to linger and have a bad death. It's not something that I think would be, I suppose, taken up very widely, but there still are lots of people that do want to have this as a choice. It's like an insurance policy, and that's the way it was with Marie. That, for instance, when we put Marie's plan together, and when our drugs arrived from Mexico, we just relaxed. We got on with living. We put them away because Marie then knew that she had that choice. She didn't have to worry about how she was going to die, or that it could be a very difficult and painful death. And we got on with living. And Marie lived for many, many years after that.
The question of the limits that any law would put on this process, you know, life becomes intolerable, but many people go through tough times in their lives and they look back on it and say, that was an awful time, but I came through it.
Yes.
So the idea that someone at a particular juncture might make a decision which, if they lived to regret it, which they don't in this case,
yep.
They would say, why did I do that?
Yes, I mean, no situation is ever 100% perfect. And for instance, and I know I refer back to our own situation. I had this agreement with Marie that if Marie decided, because there were some very difficult days for Marie that she went through, and I had this agreement with Marie that we would wait for 24 hours. That if she said to me several times, look, I'm going to go now. And we had this agreement that we would wait for 24 hours, and then I would ask her again and wait for another 24 hours. And in all those cases, it did pass. And the same process applies to people planning way ahead. It's all about planning ahead. It's not something... Unfortunately, we have lots of suicides which are reactionary to particular circumstances or whatever it is, and because people aren't getting help, and should another argument, but more help should be put into that area. But this is where people plan way ahead for the possibility. And not all people go ahead with it. Not all people who put their plans in place do actually use the process.
The question of the limits again, though,
yes.
Would you be inevitably talking about terminal illness? Now, life is a terminal illness. You know, we all end up dead.
Yes.
No one leaves this place alive. But would you circumscribe this with rules and regulation as to what might qualify and what not? If someone just got browned off with life, I mean...
Well, that facility is there already. In 1993, we legalised suicide. And the court case that we took to the High Court and the Supreme Court, one of the parts of that was discrimination for Marie, that we argued that Marie, because of her illness, was denied something which was available to an able-bodied person. The Supreme Court upheld that. So anybody has the right to take their own life. That's there already. We don't have to argue that. What we're talking about here is a situation where a person has an illness and they may not be able to avail of that themselves. They want a peaceful, easy death.
All right, so it's the assisted part,
yes,
which could implicate another person.
Exactly.
Because if someone takes their own life, as you point out, it is not illegal to so do. If somebody takes the life of another, it's murder or manslaughter.
Yes, or if they help them in their suicide by providing the means to do that, that's covered in the 1993 Act. Where it's assisted suicide. It's not regarded as murder or manslaughter.
Now, David Quinn, what do you make of Tom's argument, which sounds like a reasonable argument in certainly the circumstances that he lived through?
Well, I mean, I think the very conversation we're having, where we're talking about the circumstances under which people kill themselves either on their own or with somebody else's help, is already normalising, actually, the whole thing. Tom was saying that suicide or attempted suicide was decriminalised in 1993, but it didn't create a right to it. They wanted to make it easier for people who had attempted to kill themselves to come forward without the law hanging over their heads in order to try and reduce the rate. And make it easier to talk about and make it easier to intervene. So it certainly wasn't creating a right to suicide. That was an anti-suicide measure, actually. So there's no right to suicide. And obviously there's no right to assisted suicide.
No, but there's nothing to stop you in law. Isn't that the point that Tom was making?
No, there's not. But we don't want it to happen, obviously. And there's very extensive campaigns against suicide and very extensive helps out there. But, you know, Tom belongs to an organisation called Exit International, and Tom doesn't even try to hide the grounds under which he thinks euthanasia, assisted suicide, whatever you wish to call it, should be available. It's not just for the terminally ill. It's for people who might be chronically ill or people who have simply got old and tired of life. It says on their website that current assisted suicide laws in the countries that have them don't serve those who are not terminally ill, doesn't serve the elderly, and this really caught my eye, doesn't serve couples who wish to go together. So that could be a situation, and Tom was over in Switzerland there at the end of 2021 with a couple who had gone there for assisted suicide. One was very seriously ill, the other was not very seriously ill. So they just wanted to go together. So this is what Exit International want right now, an extremely permissive law around this. So the debate we're having, and the debate they'll probably have in the Dáil, will be around limited cases where a person is terminally ill and maybe within 6 months of the end of their life. But as we see in countries which have introduced this, like Canada, they're now debating assisted suicide for cases of mental health illness, very severe mental health illness. We've seen the grounds rapidly expand in places like Netherlands and Belgium, and the cases rapidly expand. Canada had 10,000 deaths by assisted suicide 2 years ago. That's equivalent to maybe 1,200 here. And that has been rising very quickly. So you see numbers rise, grounds expand, and Exit International isn't even pretending they don't want grounds to expand. They want it available on extremely permissive grounds.
OK, now what grounds might or might not ever come into law in Ireland will remain to be seen. But if you take the way we treat our pets, for example, if you've got a dog that's in terrible pain, we euthanize that dog. And we think it is a kind thing to do.
It's a very different thing, though, because
I'm just suggesting that the impulse to limit pain is there in us for not quite the same as members of our family, because you can't replace a child, but you can get another dog.
Yeah.
So I don't want to make an equivalence there.
Yeah.
But the instinct is to limit pain.
Yeah, no, I've heard the argument, and I suppose the basic argument against would be when you put down a dog, it doesn't change the social norms for other dogs. It doesn't tell every other dog who's very sick and dying and in pain that if you're in that situation, actually, here's an option, and the option is to be put down. But obviously, when you, as it were, put down a human being who's facing a particular condition, it tells everybody else who faces that condition, maybe that's the option for me. And it begins to change social norms rather drastically around death and dying. Like I remember a woman, or rather her son called me because there had been a debate about assisted suicide on the Late Late, and his mother suffered from the particular degenerative condition that was on the Late Late that night. And he said, my mother was very distressed about this because she was saying, what this programme is telling me is I ought to go for assisted suicide. So this is why it's so different to animals. No new social norms are created for animals. A completely new social norm is created for human beings that says under certain circumstances, actually, we understand, given your life circumstances, why you would want to kill yourself.
Tom.
Yes.
The question of the slippery slope. I mean, one of the arguments that David has mentioned is that, for example, mental health grounds, people who have a severe mental illness, that might be a situation in which someone might lose their life. In a situation where no consent is possible on their part, perhaps on the part of their relatives.
Well,
yes.
One of the things that is being put forward is this whole idea of irrationality. But none of the countries allow that. And certainly Ireland would not allow that. The idea of a mental illness preventing a person from being rational is nonsense. There are lots of mental illnesses that a person could think completely rationally. And even in Switzerland, where David is talking about, before a person the day before the person goes forward, they have to get an assessment, a mental assessment from a psychologist or a psychiatrist to prove that they are thinking rationally. The other thing that I didn't realise that I was coming along here to argue about exit. I thought we were coming along here to argue about assisted dying. The two are totally different, and I'm quite happy to.
What is the difference, just to explain?
The difference is that exit has a particular set of views, including myself. And to be honest, I mean, 20 years ago, I never thought I'd be sitting here talking about assisted dying. And almost everybody that I know that is involved in anything to put it forward or to help it are involved because of some personal circumstance in their life. And if a person hasn't had something like that in their life come to them, either a friend or a relative or somebody that they loved, then it's very difficult, I think, for them to talk about it. And they can have their own views, and I perfectly respect their views, and I respect the views of people who want to continue living. But also I respect the views of people who don't.
Yeah, but in terms of the difference between exit and, what you would propose to the Irish legislature, would you propose everything on exit's agenda?
No, of course not.
Not at all.
No, because there wouldn't be an hope in hell of that getting.
But it's ultimately what you want, though.
Of course, yes. But hold on a sec. Just because we want things doesn't necessarily mean that we can have them.
But I mean, the slippery slope is right there in front of us. We see it, and we see the argument you're making.
I'm sorry, but I disagree that the slippery slope even exists.
But you were the proof of it.
You've mentioned Canada.
Yeah.
When you go from zero, which it wasn't allowed, it was illegal up to a couple of years ago. When you go from zero to anything, when you allow people to have access to something, there is going to be an infinitesimal increase. And when you let people realise that this, whatever it happens to be, is available to them. If they want to take it up, they will. If they don't want to take it up, this is a matter of choice. If they don't want to take it up, then they don't have to.
But Tom, you're actually right there demonstrating the existence of the slippery slope, because you've just admitted that the grounds have widened in Canada, that the numbers have increased in Canada dramatically, that Exit International wants so much more than assisted suicide for the terminally ill. You yourself are talking about cases of mental health illness, and you have no philosophical objection to that. You have no philosophical objection to a couple who both want to go together to be able to avail of this.
But that's available already.
No, but it's not available. It's not available with the help of the law.
Sorry, just hold on a sec. You've said this numerous times in discussions, that it is not a right. We went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in Ireland that it is a legal right. Now, if you want to argue, if you want to argue against the Supreme Court, then feel free to do that. But they made the ruling.
If it's a right, you get help. You get help with it.
Hold on. They made a ruling that Marty was discriminated against because her illness was preventing her having legal access to something that was legally available to everybody else. Now, that is in law. That was the decision made by the Supreme Court, and that purely by chance was 10 years ago, almost to the day.
What implications did that then have for other people who wanted assisted dying?
Well, what they said at the time was that, yes, they did think the law was discriminatory, but their only option was to strike out the law. And they weren't prepared to do that. And I agreed with them completely on that, because that would leave a void. But what they did was they passed it back to the Oireachtas, and it's taken the Oireachtas 10 years to do anything about it.
If there was a right to it, they would have already created what we've got in places like Austria, where you can go in with a doctor's prescription to a chemist and bring home a lethal concoction. And same in Canada. About half of the deaths through assisted suicide take place at home, because you can go and get a prescription and go home with your lethal concoction. That's what's happening. If there was a right...
At the moment, by the way, someone can go in, and I won't mention any drugs by name, they can get a whole pack and then another pack and then another pack and take it, and they'll die.
Yeah, but it's not condoned, and it's not there as a right.
I didn't say it was condoned. I said it was a legal right. And it's not my judgment that it's a legal right. The Supreme Court ruled on it.
If it was a right, then somebody could go and say, well, OK, I can't do this successfully and painlessly on my own, therefore I'm going to need help. And that's not been suggested up until now, because it actually doesn't exist as the kind of right that you're talking about. But even if it did, it's still not being facilitated. What we're talking about here is a situation where
that's what we're talking about.
Yeah, and so it gets facilitated.
Sorry.
And it will go way, way, way beyond terminally ill, because we're already having the argument now about going way beyond the terminally ill. So we need to be under no illusions here about where this goes.
Tom, in terms of maybe people rationally thinking about things, people can be unduly influenced perhaps by relatives. You're talking about an older person who is maybe severely ill, but still compos mentis and feels, I know this is costing an arm and a leg. I'm a real burden on the family. Maybe it's time. And they would not make that decision if the pressure maybe wasn't there from relatives who are reminding them of
there are going
costs.
to be situations where relatives will try to take advantage. Murder happens. Murder is illegal. People are murdered. Not every day of the week, but it's almost getting that way in Ireland. But people break the law. People push people to do other things. You can't take away that. But by restricting access to ordinary people, to people who aren't put into these particular circumstances, is wrong.
David, the question of treating every life as being as precious as every other, there was an article by a woman called Sarah Hart in one of the newspapers during the week, and she was talking about society making choices about who gets to live and who gets to die, whose life is more valuable in the context of resources, isn't as wacky as you might think, and goes on to quote, in the pandemic, when there was a shortage of ventilators and so on, a decision was quietly made, well, the over 70s can whistle for ventilators. We'll devote our ventilators to the younger people who have yet to live a life.
Well, you see, you've got somebody there, I guess, there's a shortage of ventilators. You have...
they did that decision in Italy, as we know.
You have more people dying than there is available ventilators, and therefore you got the triage. I mean, that's standard practice in medicine, and always has been. But you're not setting out to deliberately kill somebody, even if it's at their own request. So it's quite a different thing.
You mean people made it even though they never got a ventilator?
Well, yes.
They got through it.
Yeah, but remember, you're not setting out to kill them. So you're not going into the wards and saying, we're going to inject this person, with something deadly and kill them that way. They weren't doing that. They were trying to treat them as best they could. Unfortunately, ventilators weren't available. That hardly ever happened, by the way, during the whole COVID thing. There was rarely in practice a shortage of ventilators for all kinds of various reasons. But it's just worth noting that Northern Italy was actually a rare example. But also, triage is a very different thing to deliberately killing someone, even if it's at their own request. It's just a different thing. And it's a huge kind of Rubicon for medicine to cross, that it's no longer about treating. It's no longer about keeping you comfortable in your last moments. We're now going to actually actively kill you, even if it is at your own request. So that's doctors then are no longer in the, fulfilling Hippocratic medicine anymore, which says first do no harm. They're now actively ending somebody's life. And it's just interesting to me, by the way, that the palliative care doctors are nearly always against this. So these are people who deal obviously with death and dying every day as part of their lives.
But often it happens that the pain is so great that the pain relief that is administered has a double effect.
Well, that happened to my father.
It accelerates dying.
I mean, my father died at 88 and he couldn't ingest anything anymore. He couldn't even ingest water intravenously. And so they put him on morphine. And there's no question the morphine would have ended his life a couple of days before, if he was let to go naturally. But the intention there was to kill the pain, not kill the patient. So it's a very different thing.
But isn't this the old Catholic thing of double effect? Do you remember the old debates about contraception?
Yeah.
It could regulate a cycle, for example, the pill, but it also was a contraceptive. But because it had a double function, then it was okay to use it.
Yeah, I mean, the principle of double effect is a general philosophical principle. It's not unique to the Catholic Church by any means. And again, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, my father was not deliberately killed. They were trying to manage the pain.
Yeah. Well, yes, the double effect happens all the time, and it is for the benefit of the person themselves. The thing that I would come back to is that you keep saying that this is not necessarily a task for the medical profession. We don't have to have the medical profession involved. Why does the medical profession need to be involved? And also...
the medicines, Tom, in fairness, the medicines that people might be taking are probably prescription medicines.
They are, yes.
Rather than weed killer.
Law can circumvent that. They are manufactured by pharmaceutical companies who are provided to the distributors, who provide them to the chemists, who give prescriptions for them. But the medical profession don't have to be involved. But the other thing is that where it has been brought in, for instance, Oregon, and you mentioned other places, that the medical profession are involved. The medical profession are quite at liberty either to opt out or to stay involved. And they do stay involved.
David?
Otherwise, it wouldn't happen.
Yeah, I mean, obviously I wouldn't want doctors to be involved at all, because I think it just changes the purpose of medicine. I'll just repeat the point about palliative care, that the very people who deal with death and dying every day as part of their lives and making people comfortable in the last days of their lives are against it. Now, these, in a way, you'd think these would be the doctors most in favour, but they are typically the doctors most against assisted suicide, because they're worried about the pressures it'll create, about the social norms it'll create around death and dying, the signal it sends to people whose lives are in distress, that actually there's an option here for you, and it's suicide. And, you know, like within media, there's for years and years and years been guidelines about how to discuss these kind of topics, because you can create a copycat effect. And it would just worry me that an overall, I'm not criticising the show, by the way, at all, because I mean this does need to be debated, but we've got to be very, very careful how we do it, because it can create a normalising effect in this and a copycat effect in this, and people listening thinking, well, that's the situation I'm in, and there's people on that programme and they're saying it's actually okay to go down that path, and I must consider going down that path as well. So we got to be careful.
Tom? Well, there are two things that you brought up there. One is the pressure being put on by people by society. And to me, that's a societal problem. It's society that's to blame there. Society doesn't care enough about people to provide them with the assistance. And you mentioned palliative care. We are so much lacking in the palliative care that's available in Ireland. Why is that?
Yeah, I agree with that.
So we should be providing whatever assistance is needed on both sides. If a person wants to live, they should be given every assistance they can to have a comfortable life and to ease their death, if that's the way to put it, at the time that their body chooses to go.
I'll read you
and at the same time,
they're not just their body choosing to go. You talk about their mind choosing to go, even when they're not sick.
I'll read out some of the comments. Who's to say this assisted suicide would not be abused? Another one, I support Tom 100%. Everyone should have the right to decide. I watched my brother suffer from MS for years. He never had remission. He lost every factor of his being, finally suffering a death I would not wish on anyone. We would have done anything to end his suffering, says that texter. Someone else says, David talking about Tom not being upfront about exit, unfair. The Iona Institute represents Catholic theology and the views of the Catholic Church. Why has he not been upfront about? You've never been behind the door, David.
No, I'm pretty public in my Catholicism.
In fairness to that. Now, if you've been affected by anything that you've heard in this discussion, you can contact the Samaritans at any time. It's free phone 116 123. My thanks to David Quinn, Director of the Iona Institute, columnist with the Sunday Independent, and Tom Curran, Director with Exit International. And
could I just say one thing before we finish up, if you don't mind?
Sure.
2023 happens to be two 10-year anniversaries. One is the Supreme Court decision and passing it back to the Oireachtas. But a more important one for me personally is that it will be Marie's anniversary next December. So it is my plan to, probably around November, to host a celebration of her life.
And you'll testify to the committee if so called, would you?
Absolutely. Oh, yes, yes.
And David?
Of course.
Of course. All right. Thank you both very much for joining us.